What is poetry? We know it when we see it, but poetry is notoriously hard to define. Some might suggest that poetry consists of stanzas that include rhymes, but as I'm sure you already know, not all poetry rhymes. Then perhaps we could broaden this out to suggest poetry is writing that is in verse rather than prose, which is how fiction and nonfiction are formatted. And yet, there exists the prose poem, a highly condensed form of language that reads like poetry, but is in the form of a paragraph like prose. So, what is poetry? We might say that poetry is the most compressed form of language. Rather than fiction or nonfiction, which each tend to allow for greater word counts, poetry, even longer poetry, aims to communicate the most amount of meaning in the smallest amount of space. This is what I mean when I say that poetry is compressed language. Let me give you an example of the briefest poem from our week's reading. Separation by W.S. Merwin. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. In just 3 lines, the author manages to convey an intensity of emotion and meaning. If I were to try and write out that meaning without any consideration of compression, I might write something like this. Ever since we separated, I have been feeling the pain of your absence. In everything that I do, I find myself missing you terribly. You were such an important part of my life that it has become difficult to untangle your presence from my daily experience. Everything I do carries the weight of you in it, and the weight of your absence. While this captures the same meaning, more or less, it does so using far more words. And with each extra word, the meaning becomes less and less potent. The potency of Merwin's image of the needle and thread conveys more in 19 words than I could in more than 60 words. This is what I mean by compression. With language that is so compressed, it is even more important to pay attention to the way that each word sounds in conjunction with one another. Beginning writers, or those not entirely familiar with the genre of poetry, might believe that poetry should rhyme in some way. Yet, as I mentioned, poetry does not need to rhyme, or it might utilize slant rhyme, which is near rhyme, or internal rhyme, rhymes in the middle of lines, or a myriad of other sound devices that are not just exact rhymes at the end of lines. What's important here is the attention to sound. Poetry is meant to be both read and heard. As such, we must think even more carefully about the way the words sound, how they trip off the tongue, and how the combination of sound and content suggests meaning. Here's an example of a poem that consciously pays attention to sound. This is from Praise the Rain by Joy Harjo. Praise the backwards, upward sky, the baby cry, the spirit food. Praise canoe, the fish rush, the hole for frog, the upside down. There is rhyme here, though it doesn't just come at the end of lines. Sky rhymes with cry in the middle of the second line. We also have a near rhyme or slant rhyme between food and canoe, or we might label this assonance. Then we have fish rush, which repeats the shushing sound and seems to evoke the sound of a rushing stream. Can you hear it? Here are some key takeaways about poetry. Poetry is compressed language, conveying the most amount of meaning in the least amount of words. Poetry also pays careful attention to sound, so that the ear can hear what the eye sees.